Good afternoon. It's Joyful Hermit. Well, this is the priest whose feast day. Well, he's a priest and he's a blessed. He hasn't made it to the full canonization as a saint, and he may not because he is one who was caught in a bad controversy, and that's why I relate with him so much and never knew of him before. But until I read about him on July 1, which is his feast day, celebration day. That is because he was sort of caught between two dilemmas. One was the spiritual life, and the other was temporal things going on in the church that weren't right. The conflict of priests and bishops and Catholic parishioners, and people in religious life, not really totally focused on the spiritual life, and too caught up in the temporal. So he recognized the divide, and he not only recognized it, but he wrote about it. He wanted an appeal for this to change, and he got thrown under the bus. Wasn't a bus in those days, but under the horse and carriages. And so I want to talk to you about him and think in your own life. And then, because I've been praying about different things that come up that are controversial, or one thing I haven't really talked about yet that's controversial regarding hermits now, this canon law thing. I have in my blog written about the canon law for hermits and pretty much why I think, don't touch it. I think it's going to have a lot of problems, more than it already does. And it's also going to discourage people, it already has, from being the time-honored and the proven noble path of the hermits of all the ages, who were not in for it, getting status for it, and weren't standing out as hermits intentionally. Those that were very holy did get noticed, but when they were out, and they're known now, but when they were alive and out in the desert, they just blended in with the others who dressed like poor people. So anyway, and then also just for ourselves personally, are we going to be more partial, one leg in a trap, like a wounded animal in a trap, caught in more temporal? Or are we going to stay with what I think God intends for us, the spiritual journey of spiritual perfection, striving for spiritual perfection? They used to call it that, spiritual perfection. And of course, we know how difficult it is to come to union with God, because it requires increasing degrees of spiritual perfection. And ultimately, that love of God above all things, and to love others and love ourselves as God loves, in the way that God loves, which is pure love. So it takes a lifetime for a few, some who are extremely blessed and gifted spiritually, and the rest of us I will be progressing on in the next life. I will be continuing to progress, and eventually I pray to have union with God. So this is Blessed Antonio Rosmini. That's his name, Rosmini. I'm gonna put my glasses on. That means I'm getting serious here. I'm getting into my little mode of reporting all my little notes that I took on his life. So he was known as priest and founder of the community that he founded is called the Institute of Charity. He was born in 1797, so at the very, very end of the 18th century, and he lived the first half of the 19th century, in the 1800s. He didn't live all that long. Stress will do it to you. He died in 1855. He was only 58 years old when he died. But and it was less than a year after he was vindicated. He went through some troubling times, and heartbreaking, really, because what a good soul he was. So well-intentioned and very intelligent, and studied, and he gave himself to the Catholic Church, gave himself over. And when push came to shove, he even chose obedience to the authority of the church over, essentially, truth of what he witnessed and saw and knew from his being alive and research and studies. So let's hear a little bit more about him. He was born in 1797, and he just in a little tiny town in an area of Italy that was near Austria. And in fact, his town had been under the governance of Austria for years, couple of centuries. So excuse my itching again, it's the arachnoiditis symptoms. I mention that every now and then in these videos, because I don't expect people to look back for the trivia I mentioned, but that's part of, my itching, and your skin feels like it has bugs on you all the time. Fun, not a fun little ailment to have is arachnoiditis. But it's the arachnoid membrane that got slit. That's the membrane on the spinal cord. It's spider-like looking, and it is like spiders crawling on you too, on your skin. So he was born in a town called Rovereto, Italy. In 1816, he entered the University of Padua, Italy, and eventually got a doctorate in theology and in canon law. They had canon laws in that century. I forget how long they've had canon laws. I think since Middle Ages or toward the end of the Middle Ages. They didn't always have canon laws. And now we've got something like 1,852 of them. And most of them aren't enforced. It's hard to enforce them. Or if someone finds out, then they have to dig around to find out what canon laws they broke. So in 1820, he graduated, had his doctorate. He went with his younger sister, accompanied her to Verona, because she was going to join a community. She was going to become a nun, and she did. And the Mother Superior there, it was a new community for women, asked Antonio, he wasn't a priest yet, asked him if he would start a twin community to the women's group. And he declined that. It was quite an offer for a young man, but he was going to enter the priesthood. So that's within 6 months he did. He was ordained a priest in 1821. And 2 years later, in 1823, he went to Rome with the Patriarch of Venice, Italy. He was more from northern Italy. I think that, Venice is more north. And he went with this Patriarch of Venice, and that Patriarch arranged for a special meeting with the then Father Rosmini, with the Pope at the time. It was Pope Pius the VIII. And at that audience with Pope Pius VIII, Father Rosmini was asked to reform philosophy, write more and reform the writings of philosophy in the church. Not secular philosophy, but church philosophy, religious philosophy. So he was quite a student. So he started doing that. In 1826, he went to Milan, Italy, to research more and to publish his writings on philosophical studies and on his philosophical studies and the findings that he found in his research. So he wrote one book called The Origin of Ideas and Certitude. Or no, he wrote on these topics. This is what he wrote on. He wrote and wrote and wrote, and he didn't even have constant pain. He was just a writer and a scholar. Very good. And it's amazing how that Pope noticed that in this young man when he was just 26 years old, barely 26. So some of his topics that he wrote about are on the origin of ideas and certitude, nature of the human soul. So he liked the spiritual life too, and how our soul develops and how we worship and love God and things. He wrote on ethics, on the relationship between church and state, philosophy of law, include canon law, and law in general, obedience to laws and things, metaphysics, which would be more the mystical life, grace, original sin, the sacraments, and education. So he was widely read, widely studied, and widely written. On Ash Wednesday in 1828, he withdrew from more active life, any kind of active life, to write the constitutions of his budding Institute of Charity, because he did found the male counterpart. He found this, it was a totally separate. His own religious order community he started, and it was approved by the Pope to start it, and it was called the Institute of Charity. So he was writing the constitutions for it then, and in the constitutions, he based these constitutions of this religious order on two things: the principle of passivity. And I think that these are two important principles for us to consider in our own spiritual lives. The principle of passivity is this: one's personal sanctification, of being passive, of being concerned with our personal sanctification until God's will manifests for us to undertake some external work of charity. So in other words, we work quietly on our own souls, our own personal spiritual lives, until that time that we know God's will on what he wants us to undertake actively in the active life, in acts of charity, for example, acts of love, once we know God's will in that. But until then, until we know his will for our life in acts of charity or doing things for others, and that can be prayer, a life of prayer, or a life of temporal works, corporal works of mercy, or spiritual. It can be either of those. And then the principle of impartiality is this: to free ourselves of any personal preference in assuming a work of charity. So, for example, if I stuck to my personal preference of writing on my blog instead of yapping, sort of extemporaneously often, on topics that come up in my spiritual life or my temporal life, or also things with the church or things with God. And it can be both. The church and God obviously have very strong connection because Christ is the head of his church. And we sinners are the body of his church, striving to not be sinners. So, it's all combined, but there are sort of points of differentiation. So I decided to do the videos because of this canonical hermit who for 17 years trashed me and really distracted from what I was writing and saying on my blog. Totally destroyed my reputation, my ugliness, and had developed herself as an authority, as a authority in hermits. So that's what happened. So I stopped writing for a while, but I am a writer of types, either a writer or a speaker. I have ideas and thoughts, and I have had this inner urge for a long, long time, and I don't know if it's my mission or not. So I've been working on my personal sanctification, trying to grow, to work in my spiritual life, within my spiritual life. And then I journal it, either in writing or in now sharing, verbally sharing. So this is why this is relevant to me, but I would think it's relevant to any of you, because we all have missions. God has things for us to do in our temporal life. Like when I died and he was asking me if I wanted to go on with him or go back to life, and I didn't want to go back to life. I wanted to stay with God. It was too wonderful to go back. But he showed me my children playing in grass at the lake and with my mom and dad, having a wonderful time. Then showed me just the head of my ex-husband. And his head was all like puffed out, red, angry in temper. So I still couldn't say I would go back. But God asked me again. And finally I said, I will do what you want, God. I will do whatever you want. And God said, I'm sending you back to rear your children. That was my act of charity, my act of duty and love for my children. And then he said, then to rear your children and to fulfill your mission. My children are reared. I've been trying to figure out my mission for God, that what God wants of me, what he wants of me for him. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because I don't know for sure. And my writing outlet got really thrown under the horse and carriage, thrown under the laptop and stomped on, in other words. My keyboard laptop, my writing capabilities. So now I'm doing this window to the world that a hermit always had, some little window or some portal of hospitality with others, or talking about the spiritual life with other people who would come. So that I just found it very interesting what Father Rosmini had to deal with himself also. This really wonderful priest, scholar priest, more than a, but he did preaching and stuff also. So he then assured himself of God's will in philosophical work and the founding of the Institute of Charity. That's what he finally realized God had wanted him to do after he had done all this writing and research and praying about what he should do. His active work was in continuing to publish his his books, his writings, and to found this Institute of Charity. So he returned to Rome in November of 1828 and was received by, he received then Pope Leo the XII's support. 6 months later, in May, Father Rosmini returned to Rome, and it was in May of 1829, he met with the new Pope, Pope Pius XIII, who confirmed his double mission of philosopher and founder. He was to do both, continue as a philosopher of religion, a philosophy of all those topics I mentioned, listed out, having to do with the soul, having to do with charity, love of God and things, our spiritual lives, and many, many other aspects. And then to actively, physically found this religious order called the Institute of Charity. So he then published Maxims of Christian Perfection. Wise would be wise sayings of Christian perfection. I'm going to look on my bookshelves to see if I have a little book like that, because I have lots of little books I got that have titles like that. I'll see if I find one from him, because it's out of print. All of his writings have been out of print for quite a while. The other book he had published was Origin of Ideas, and these two books were admired greatly by many scholars. In 1832, the Institute of Charity, his religious order that he founded, had spread from southern Italy to northern Italy. In 1835, it reached England. Some of you viewers of my little blog, my little video site, might know of this priest. Remember him from history, because it really grew substantially. And by 1835, when they reached England, England was very ripe for his community of charity, his Institute of Charity. And the Rosminians, as they were called, the priests who were in it, and the monks, are credited for introducing these things, these aspects. I was amazed. They are credited with introducing the use of the Roman collar and the cassock. That's the long black outfit, sort of fitted at the waist, very handsome looking black garments that priests would wear all through, even through Vatican II. In the 1900s they wore them, and then later on just wore, black pants and a black shirt with the Roman collar. But yeah, he introduced that, the wearing of the Roman collar and the cassock, and also is credited with the practice of wearing religious habits in public. They didn't before then. Some of it for safety's sake, because, in England especially, they were being killed, hunted down, priests were, after Henry VIII's suppression of the Catholic Church and creating his own church, the Church of England. And when I was Episcopal, I was briefly Episcopalian. In this country, the Church of England, Anglicans are called Episcopalians. And when I went through the instruction on that church, which was only, I think, 2 hours or something, or Sunday morning of meeting, or a Tuesday evening meeting, and talking about the history. And when I realized more the history of how that church was created by a king who was upset that he couldn't get his annulments from these various women that he would marry and who didn't produce male heirs to the throne. That's why I thought, well, I don't want to be in I started realizing, why be in a church that's started by a human being? And so then that's when I started praying, and definitely prayed a few years later very intently after I realized why I'm in a church that Martin Luther started. So I prayed, Jesus, what is the church you started? Anyway, that's off topic as usual with me. So he was also known, the Rosminians, the people, he and his men of his religious order were known for preaching missions, the practice of 40 hours devotion, they got that popularized, May devotions, use of the scapular, novena celebrations, public professions, um, public processions, meaning, um, like a processional. Public processionals is what I meant. Like at Corpus Christi. Some churches, even just in June, had a procession, a public procession with the Blessed Sacrament, the body and blood of Christ, in procession, celebrating. And also, they popularized the blessing of throats, or got it going again, reintroduced or made it more prevalent again, the blessing of throats on the feast of St. Blaise, Bishop and Martyr. I believe that's February 3rd, is that date, the day after the presentation of Jesus in the temple, which is February 2nd. So he really did a lot for the church, and in revitalizing a lot of these wonderful celebrations and rituals and traditions and prayer forms, devotions and things. It's great. So in 1838, Pope Gregory the 16th approved the constitutions for the Institute of Charity. In 1839, just 3 months later, after the constitutions were approved by the then Pope, vows were taken by 20 Italian and 6 British priests. That was the beginning, the start of the Institute of Charity. In 1839, he was appointed Provost General for life of the Institute of Charity. Quite an honor. Then, all the happiness of all the good he was doing contrasted with the opposition to his intellectual and philosophical writings. From 1826 until his death in 1855, 29 years, he was persecuted. His writings were. They were put down by other priests and bishops. Really, not all, but many. And of course, even parishioners were influenced because of the gossip that went around, and priests and bishops who would put down what he wrote and, oh, don't read that, don't, controversial. This big controversy went on, especially these 2 writings, the Treatise on Moral Conscience and the 5 Wounds of the Church. Those 2 alone went through 15 years of opposition. So the Pope submitted all of Father Rosmini's writings, all of them, because he was wedged. He was really put in a terrible position. There was his whole life work of being asked by this earlier Pope to study and write and research these different topics, to be a philosopher and also be a religious founder. And he did a great job of it. And the writings he wrote were well researched, plus his observations, his knowledge, and what he knew from within, from his spiritual life too. God's will. But it became just so controversial. And he was wedged between obedience to the church and essentially the truth, speaking the truth. And this struck me also because when Father Vincent called on Sunday, it was, and or Saturday, it was Saturday he called, because Sunday he was having a renewal of his vows and celebration of so many years in the priesthood thus far, and also his superior of his religious order wanted to talk to him about making another move again to another area in Nigeria and having more responsibilities. So it's very important. I haven't heard what's happened yet. Keep you posted. But there were all of his writings, so much controversy. Finally, the Pope, a Pope in 1854, submitted all of Father Rosmini's writings, his books, his articles, everything, to what's called the Congregation of the Index. We probably have heard of the Index, if not, because I had to learn all this stuff as a convert. It was an index of all the different books and writings that were taboo, that needed to be not read, burned, whatever. And it really discredited the people who wrote them. It was a blight on them, on their name, on their personhood, on their life's work. They were, in essence, tarred and feathered. Not physically, though, but in their reputations. Their reputations were trashed. If they were on the index, they were skeptical. If they were on the index, they were like, oh my goodness, so-and-so's on the index. Better be careful. Better not pay much attention. And even if but if they got cleared even, there was always that taint. It's like, any kind of gossip even that sort of looks askance at someone. It's very hard to get that cleared. People will believe the negative much more than they will the positive about someone. Or often it will be, or it's hard to clear the negative, in other words. We've heard that in journalism. A journalist writes something that's incorrect, which happened to me from the neighbor lady, the crazy neighbor lady who wrote this horrible story that I had hung her little grandson's kitty from my garage door and all these other terrible things about me. And the newspaper gal, it was a jeers and cheers column where you could write in things that other people did that were terrible or else wonderful in the community. And this was in a city. This lady wrote in, and it got published. This young gal should never have published it without checking to see if it was real or not. Sort of like the Hermit lady, No one ever checks if what she says about herself is true. So I had people after. I had to get a detective was put on the case, the postal inspector. I was getting death threats in the mail. Oh, it was terrible. And while they didn't put my address in, they put her address in as the person who wrote this made-up story about me. And at the time, I was the only one living beside her. My house was there, and no one built beside me for the next couple of years. So it was terrible. I lived in fear. I had to learn not to, though, because and it was just outside the city limits in a new subdivision, and so we were under the sheriff's department for help, and I could have easily been shot and wounded or something, or strangled, and they wouldn't have found me for quite a while because there weren't enough people living in the subdivision yet. So anyway, it was that's what can happen to you. And my son, who's in journalism in New York City now, at the time he was, no, he was in New York City then. Then he was working for CBS, but he talked to them. He called this city newspaper, but they had all their lawyers already ready to fight it and saying, well, since they didn't put, she had taken my name out, fortunately. She had it in at first. Who it was who did this. I had the animal rights people threatening me. And even some of my friends, that was you? I mean, well, no, we know it's not you, but that was who she was. They couldn't believe it because they had read it and thought, what a horrible woman to hang this little child's kitty from her garage door. I had it all. Oh, my goodness, So anyway, sorry to get off on that, but that's just what happens. And my oldest daughter wanted me to sue Anna, not because... and my son said too that knowing how it is with corporations, of which he's one, they're teams of lawyers. It's hard for you to win a case unless something does physically happen to you. Like if I had been killed, my kids could have won a case and sued the newspaper and gotten a settlement. But it wasn't going to be a big splash that in the court system that this old lady who lives alone and is religious and quiet had really any terrible damages. So I just had social ones is all. That's all. Everybody in the subdivision turned against me as it moved in because she would keep telling people. And she had copies of her little article that was put in from the Jeers and Cheers column. So yes, I felt for this man, this priest, terribly. So he even stated he was so sincere. He had given his life to the church. So he stated this publicly. He wrote it out and made a public statement. In everything, I want to base myself on the authority of the church, and I want the whole world to know that I adhere to that authority alone. So he took it. He took the abuse, the persecution, and having his name and all of everything he ever wrote on that being examined by the index. And most things that were submitted a lot of them were deemed terrible, heretical. That was what he was up against. Was he going to be, his writings and his thoughts deemed heretical, blasphemous, So finally, this controversy went on for 15 years. Well, actually 29 years of his life, but those two books for 15 years, alone for 15 years, went on in controversy. So finally, in 1854, on July 3rd, the then Pope, who, did I mention who that was? I don't know who it was then. It was the same one that did declared the Immaculate Conception. Pope Pius XII, maybe, or 13th. Was that it? Anyway, that Pope, July 3rd, cleared and made a decree that all his works were to be dismissed by the index. That meant released from it. They weren't, not reviewed anymore, not under review, not under examination. And that it should not, that his having been put into the index, put under examination, all his writings, should not detract from his writings or from his good name or the religious society he founded, nor should reflect negatively on his life or merits to the church. Well, how many people in Italy, even in his hometown, in that time period, would know of that. The communication system wasn't like it was on internet or on X, which used to be Twitter. It wasn't on Facebook. It wasn't announced. It was announced, in Rome at the Vatican, some decree put out. But yes, so he died less than a year later at age 58. I think he died from stress and heartbreak. I'm sure he was relieved, but would I be able to do that? Would I have such allegiance? I don't know. I already have been trashed, by various priests and things these ones that were worried that God would have me see into all of them. I have this gift of inner sight. Many of you do. And no, it doesn't work that way. God doesn't just carte blanche show us everybody's soul and all the things they're doing or any naughty things they've done or stuff like that. No, it's if he has an assignment for us, yes, then we're shown things, or we're to clear up something, or we are to report something that's bad, or try to work with the person or do something like that. But no, we're not. I haven't been given assignments for a long time. I don't even know, like with this lady hermit, as I've mentioned, if I should say anything to anyone about, who's ever even inquired or done investigation of her to see if all this stuff that she claims she is. We don't know, but she trashes people. She's done it to a bishop now. And I noticed that our Sunday Visitor newspaper quoted her in trashing a bishop and a hermit. So, no, I don't think that they haven't even called to see if she's really a canonical hermit herself or if her bishop knows about her. Well, they know about her because I called 3 years ago and they didn't know a thing about her then. So, because I wanted them to get her to stop harassing and trashing what I wrote. But anyway, it's just an interesting situation. Here's this blessed. He's been beatified, or is that what being blessed is? But he's not been canonized, and I don't see how he will be. God will, because what a wonderful human being wrote all that. And this book, the five wounds of the church, I'm going to address that separately. But I looked it up and I took a photo of the information. Get it here. What it has to do with. The five wounds of the Holy Church presupposes an analogy between the holy wounds suffered by the Lord's natural body, pierced on the cross, and his mystical body, the church, pierced by the sins and errors of men in the ages of Christian history. So what Father Rosmini had written in this Five Wounds of the Church book that he had published was the things that people, religious and all, were doing, saying, thinking, living, that was more caught up with the temporal world than with their spiritual progression. And the bishops and things that would fight between one another, the divisions going on in the body of Christ, between the clergy, between parishioners, this clash that goes on and goes on all through of the spiritual life versus the temporal life. Those of us who get caught up in temporal things, like, does so-and-so have a right to be a hermit or not? That kind of stuff. Does that bishop have a right to have approved this person or that or whatever? As opposed to our spiritual soul development. So it's very fascinating, all this. And so I might want to talk about this further and go into some of the specific flaws that Father Rosmini saw in his own time. Tragedies, really, that he saw of divisions going on within the church among different groups that was keeping us from spiritual progression and advancement for God. Prohibit us from being all for God and lowering our standards as people and as Catholics, getting entangled in the nets that are just beneath the surface of the water, instead of swimming freely on out into the deep. Duc et altum, as Pope John Paul II said. Swim out into the deep. Go out and come to God. Come to union with God. So that's the end of this video. I just found it really as if God was directly leading me in my sorting through what my mission is for him that I'm to be fulfilling. And so it's sort of coming into formation a little bit. But I do need to pray about if what happened to him when he wrote and exposed things that were bad. It basically took him out of circulation and shortened his life. He was only 58. It caused his books to not be read. None of them are in print now. But they had merit. 2 of them had great acclaim among scholars. That one was The Life of Christian Perfection, the Maxims of Christian Perfection. Probably an excellent book for anyone to read for advancing in the spiritual life. Imagine if John of the Cross's writings had been put on the index, and then at all, even. What a blight that would have been to his life. He probably never would have been canonized or called into. He's now a doctor of the church also. Oh, these things can weigh very seriously. They don't have the index anymore, I don't believe. I think they got rid of that with Vatican II, maybe. And it's probably as well, because saying negatives about people can stick with them, even if they're better. My son did try to get this big city newspaper to write a retraction, and they refused to. But they said I could write something. And my son really wanted me to write something. But I was afraid that it would only stir it up again, and then people would have my name. And that seed had been planted. What that lady wrote and got published was so lurid sounding. It even said what my little grandson said, "Daddy, did you see the lady smile when Daddy cut, or Grandma, you should have seen the lady smile when Daddy cut our kitty down." The kitty was never hanging, so from my garage door. So, see, I mean, how is I going to clear that image out of 600,000 peoples in all the outlying towns that took that newspaper? Probably a couple million people's minds, or, well, not that many read it, but the ones who did. And the threat letters I was getting, they certainly believed it. So, no, I mean, it's hard to regain. That's why, and to try, and in my case, even trying to get other blogs with other titles. God, I was shocked that on some list of, was it 10 blogs or something, I was sixth most read Catholic blog or something. I wasn't, though it has stopped. The readership, how many views is very, very low. And it's not that I have anything great to say. It's just the idea of what somebody can do to you, and who has a title and has been canonically approved by a bishop or whatever, gives status. So people will believe someone like that. But I prefer being nothing, being a nothing Catholic hermit, and I hope you all prefer being nothings, because we are gods, see. We are nothing except what God wants us to be. And I just find that beautiful. That's the ultimate. That's the ultimate, I think, is to be nothing other than what God wants of us. That's not part of what it means to die to ourselves. And to do exactly what Father Rosmini said in his, he called it the principle of passivity and the principle of impartiality. God bless His real presence in us.